In fact, hardly anyone in the city fit into a society whose rules assumed that almost everyone was either a noble or a peasant.
Maria Bochkayova, known as Yashka, left a detailed account of war and revolution on the Eastern Front. The daughter of a former serf, she had petitioned the Tsar to allow her to join the army.
The rule of kings was successfully challenged, and the principles of democracy were applied for the first time toward the end of the 18th century in the American and French revolutions.
Louis Bartas's regiment began to discuss election of new officers.
To my amazement, they put my name forward as a replacement for the colonel. Imagine, me, an obscure peasant, commander of the 296th Regiment. It was beyond belief.
The nationalist spirit that had been born as a yearning for liberty was now being used as a justification for war.
Many were caught up in Nivelle's bravado, but not Louis Bartas.
We had read to us an order of the day from the great executioner, General Nivelle, saying amongst other absurdities that the hour of sacrifice has arrived. Well, no one was enthused by this lecture of patriotic gibberish.
Okay kids, let's learn about cultural Marxism, starting with the academic viewpoint. So, the academics who do use the term cultural Marxism limit the phenomena specifically to areas of cultural analysis, not cultural practice, and further limit it to a period starting in the 1930s and going no later than the 1980s, although some academics declare cultural Marxism dead as early as the 1950s. During this time period, the Frankfurt School was the prevailing influence within cultural studies and academic analysis of culture as a burgeoning field of study. The Frankfurt School are not seen as a socially active force, but are seen as passive theorists with competing interpretations and explanations for how culture is created and how it functions. During this time period, the 1930s through to the 1980s, the Frankfurt School discussed and formed the West's understanding of the production and consumption of culture. They viewed this production and consumption as a top-down process, understanding culture as something being imposed from above onto the masses by social elites, aristocrats, and the capitalist institutions that make up the culture industry. This understanding of culture as a top-down imposition onto the masses is what defines cultural Marxism. This is the cultural Marxist interpretation of the production and consumption of culture under capitalism. They produce it, we suck it up like a sponge. This is what the Frankfurt School's essential complaint was, that the masses weren't actually in control of the culture they lived in, and that in fact a ruling class were for the first time in history artificially creating culture intended for mass consumption and mass profit, aka mass culture, pop culture, or cultural hegemony. But why was this a problem for the Frankfurt School? Why did they focus on this issue in particular? It was because they'd witnessed firsthand for themselves the changes to German culture during the rise of 1930s fascism and Nazism. This was the context and main background for their writings. Nazi Germany was the culture they were commenting on and escaping from, and this is why America, who fought the Nazis, took them in. Most academics aren't familiar with the term cultural Marxism, and the academics who do use the term tend to already be Marxists themselves. Very few other academics have heard of it. This is partially due to Karl Marx's focus on concrete economic causes for inequality, which makes a cultural version of Marxism seem like an oxymoron, and partly due to it being such a broad term. It hence remains an informal academic term, never finding solid definition within academic writings. Another contributing factor to the term's obscurity is the fact that The Frankfurt School academics never used the term themselves, and none of them identified in this way. This is why the term is described as an informal term, and why it's obscure. It's not actually in any of their writings. It's an after-the-fact label that most academics simply won't come across. And by today's standards, this term, as well as the mode of analysis the Frankfurt School adopted, is pretty obsolete. The Frankfurt School themselves didn't share a singular worldview and argued with each other about most things. Who is included as part of the Frankfurt School changes depending on which authors you read, and the term the Frankfurt School is likewise an informal, after-the-fact grouping. There was, however, a consistent background in Marxism at the Frankfurt School, but all of the Frankfurt School theorists slowly gravitated away from orthodox Marxism during their time there. So why do the few academics who do choose to use the term Cultural Marxism conclude its influence as ending during the 1980s? This is because the Frankfurt School's rival, the Birmingham School, became prevalent during this time, with its own theories seeking to understand and explain culture. Specifically, Stuart Hall's class mixing theory, the encoding-decoding model of communication. Rather than the top-down perspective on culture that the Frankfurt School favoured, the Birmingham School started a discussion of culture as an interactive field, something which we were all creating and could all be a part of. At around the same time, critical theory was coming into its own. Critical theory is the idea that ruling class capitalism isn't the only force behind the construction of culture and ideology, but that ideology can manifest in all sorts of places if it's allowed to unnoticed. Critical theory sought to find the invisible aspects of ideology in everything from the layout of prisons and shopping malls to how we deal with the mentally ill. So that's the academic viewpoint, that cultural Marxism was the body of cultural analysis performed by the Frankfurt School theorists between the 1930s and the 1980s, in which they viewed mass culture as a top-down imposition fed to us by a ruling class through a culture industry. The fact, however, is that the Birmingham School's understanding of culture as something that we all produce and participate in superseded the Frankfurt School's viewpoint during the late 70s to early 80s, concluding cultural Marxism as an academic force. But this hasn't stopped the right wing of politics from adopting the Frankfurt School's viewpoint and claiming that minorities are actually the ones currently in the top-down position of control over our culture. The right-wing viewpoint is that the Frankfurt School weren't aiming to critique or even to understand cultural production from an academic viewpoint, but that they were in fact aiming to take over culture, and that they did so, not via debate or any rational academic discourse, but by simply influencing a generation to take over for them. This has led to today's claims that social constructivists, feminists, critical theorists, Marxists, and Jews are all part of the Frankfurt School, with us their passive subjects. This is, however, not the case, and far too close to the claims of the very German fascists the Frankfurt School were interested in escaping and analyzing.